I think one of the things that nobody should really underestimate when we talk about protecting the crown jewels and mission critical assets is the different people that you need to get involved and need to be speaking with in order to effectively roll out comprehensive security end to end across the supply chain.
This is a Security Weekly production. Security Weekly is a resource of Cyber Risk Alliance.
The Cybersecurity Collaborative, in conjunction with Cyber Reason, is proud to present CISO Stories. Each week, CISO Stories takes a deep dive on security leadership. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/CSC. I am your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Steve Durbin, Chief Executive for the Information Security Forum, or ISF.
Oh, it's nice to be here, Todd. Thanks very much for having me on.
Well, thank you. And so before we get started here, what made you get into the information security field?
Gosh, it's going back a little while now. I think the major driver was, for me anyway, was that it was a very fast-moving, fast-changing, dynamic space. So I'm going back, what is it now? 12 years. So yeah, I've been in the industry for 12 years. Came from very much more of a technology consultancy background. Spent some while with EY doing work for them in things like mergers and acquisitions and so on. And so got a glimpse into the way that cyber was changing, information security was changing, and really saw that as something of an opportunity. So that's how I ended up really in the industry. As I say, it was really that sort of dynamism, the speed, the change. I'm very attracted to those sorts of industries, and as well the impact on people, which we continue to see on a pretty much daily basis these days.
And you must have seen a lot of different ways that organizations were doing things and working with EY through those years.
Yeah, absolutely. As I say, I did a little work in M&A and also IPOs, both in Europe and also in the States, particularly taking companies onto the big board. And I think one of the things that I reflect back on now was that very rarely did security ever come up in that sort of due diligence process that we were going through, and it was never something that was front and center. And that's interesting to look back at, particularly when today we talk about cyber really fueling organizations and everything that we do being technology enabled, and so therefore information security having taken on a very much more important place in pretty much every boardroom around the world.
Well, and we've had a couple large breaches lately as well that were, point back to the due diligence and the merger of two large organizations, and where the acquiring company kind of got caught with the security controls that were in the acquired company.
Yeah, there's been a few of those, haven't there? And I think that really just points to one of the big challenges for the industry going forward, in that we are not talking about simple systems. We're talking about really highly complex environments, and when we look at it from an M&A standpoint, really trying to dig into some of those elements to make sure that you've got a full understanding of the overall landscape for these very large organizations. That's pretty well nigh impossible, as indeed we've seen with some of the impact in the instances you just alluded to there.
Sure, absolutely. So let's get into your great article that you wrote for the CISO Compass book, Protecting the Crown Jewels. So why don't you walk us through that?
Yeah, I think the sort of the fundamental behind this one was really trying to, I think, shine a bit of a light on the importance of assets to an organization. And as we've just been saying, the difficulty associated with trying to identify them, trying to assess perhaps some of the major threats that might be relevant to them, determining some form of protection strategy around them, and really looking at it from a whole life information cycle standpoint. And that was really the jumping off point on there. And it really came about from some research we'd been doing with our members, where a large proportion of them, and as you know, Todd, a lot of our members are Fortune and Forbes companies, multinationals, operating pretty much all around the world. And a significant proportion of them were very concerned about the level of protection that they were able to provide for their organization's mission-critical information assets. And that was the starting point, really. That coupled with some frustration, I think, from information security in particular, that perhaps business leaders were not even fully aware of some of the challenges that the security organization was facing in trying to protect some of these assets.
So how do you go about identifying some of those critical assets for the organization? Are there techniques for doing that?
There are. And I think that, it's worth sort of just saying here before we get into that I do think that this particular space is becoming even more complex and even more problematic for organizations, particularly at the current time, because a lot of the information that we're sharing from a critical asset standpoint is probably extended now outside of what would have been considered to be the organizational heartland, because we've seen a lot of people having to work from remote locations. We've seen a need to continue to share information with our third-party providers. Some of the ways in which we were used to conducting audit around security was actually to turn up on site. And of course, we can't do that at the moment. So this whole area of protection of the critical asset is becoming ever more important. So how do you go about identifying them? Well, I think the first thing to say in that is that assets are mission critical to different organizations, either from the get-go or indeed over a period of their life. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you happen to be, let's say, a ketchup manufacturer, the recipe for that ketchup, everybody would probably immediately recognize as being mission critical, because you don't want that to fall into the wrong hands. But if you happen to be, say, a technology provider and you're bringing to market a particular product, doesn't really matter what it is, as you get it to the point where you've got your marketing programs beginning to kick in, some of that marketing information could become critical asset to the organization, but only for a temporary period of time. So when we talk about mission critical assets, they have longevity across the organization, as in the example of the ketchup recipe, but in other instances as well, they could be just there for a particular period in time. And so from a security standpoint, this really does emphasize the fact that this isn't something that security can do on its own. It is about really working with the business, working with business leaders in particular, and beginning by asking a number of questions around the value of certain information. And I always say it's best to look at it from the perspective of, well, would you be able to function effectively without it? What would be the effect if it fell into the wrong hands? What would be the effect if you could no longer access it? I think in the book we also talk a lot about personal information and some of the legislation that has come in to protect that. So identifying the mission critical asset from the start is challenging enough, because you really have to go through this process of identification, discovering the particular mission critical assets, assessing the business value of those assets, determining what we call at the ISF anyway, a business impact rating for some of those assets. So you have to rank them, and then specifying what those assets are, what they look like, and then getting agreement to that from across the organization, which very often takes you into the business departments. And that's the identification stage. And then clearly you can move on to do very much more with that. But that's the most critical element in anything you have to do.
The article this podcast is based upon can be viewed in the best-selling cybersecurity leadership book, CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, available at Amazon.com and other booksellers. So when you assess the business value, is that a quantitative or a quantitative type assessment?
This is an interesting space, because I think traditionally, from an information security standpoint, we've tended to look at things from a qualitative point of view. Increasingly, though, when we get into the world of the information asset, business folks in particular want to put a number on it. That's one of the ways in which they can really get their heads around the value of it to an organization. And so quantifying that, or the absence of it, is a really useful way of just making the point that it is a mission critical asset because of the impact not accessing it would have. And by the way, this is also the dollar value that we would be able to attribute to a threat to it, the loss of it, or theft of it.
So is it the contribution to the revenue stream, or how much it would cost to replace that asset, or what sort of guidance would you give for that?
Yeah, it can fit into a number of ways. That's one good way of looking at it. One other, really back into the legislative regulatory space, of course, is if we're talking about a personally identifiable piece of information, then it's worth being able to attribute the cost of that in terms of things like legal action, fines, and so on. Some of the instances that we've seen relatively recently around loss of personally identifiable information on both sides of the Atlantic, British Airways, for instance, having a fairly hefty fine levied by the UK Information Commissioner, people like Experian over in the United States having to reach out-of-court settlements, class action suits being the norm now for loss of personal information, particularly in the United States. So a number of different ways in which you can put a dollar value on these things, but it's certainly useful to do that from a constructive standpoint that says, this is what it means to the business. Could be that it's generating additional revenue for us. And also then from a destructive point of view that says, and if we lose it, by the way, there's this whole heap of pain that's coming our way.
Sure, and I know GDPR has added, a whole new level of attention onto these assets, with the fines being larger than any other legislation I'm aware of that we've had to date.
No, that's absolutely right. I think the essence of GDPR when it was brought in was that it should actually have teeth. People should really sit up and pay attention to it, and that's certainly been the case. And there have been some really eye-watering fines that have been levied, and I think that was probably necessary in the early days, just so that the information commissioners could make the point that they were taking this very seriously.
Sure. And you mentioned, one of the difficulties here is, it's hard to just get our arms around our own systems and what we have. And you talked about the complex supply chains and the new emerging technologies, and how do we make sure that we're, capturing the crown jewels that are going into those systems?
Yeah, it's about capturing them, Todd. It's also about making sure that the level of security around them when they enter a third party's environment is akin to the one that you would like to see yourselves. So I think that identification is certainly there. I think it's about assessment as well. It's about understanding some of the threats that the assets might be liable to, whether they be within your own environment or somebody else's, and then just tracking the movement of them. So again, if we go back to that earlier example of a manufacturing entity, releasing a new product, very often today those products are assembled in the home country, the country of release. Manufacture of the different componentry often takes part outside of that home country, typically in someone like Southeast Asia. But again, it's about us really understanding the value of some of these things and then getting that message across to the third parties that are producing the componentry in this particular instance, and having checks and balances in place so that we're comfortable that security around that intellectual property in that instance is really being maintained. And traditionally, the way we've done that for certainly tier one suppliers is to actually physically turn up on site to ask them to go through a security evaluation process. That's become increasingly more difficult today, of course, particularly during the pandemic, where we can't do it. And so we're having to adjust security requirements for suppliers. I mean, some organizations really having to revisit some of the minimum security requirements and apply amendments to existing and indeed new contracts. So we've moved already just in that one short space from this being a security issue, protecting the information, the intellectual property, into having to engage now with legal, with procurement, with perhaps third-party supplier assessment organizations within our own enterprise. So I think one of the things that nobody should really underestimate when we talk about protecting the crown jewels and mission-critical assets is the different people that you need to get involved and need to be speaking with in order to effectively roll out comprehensive security end-to-end across the supply chain.
Yeah, and so you mentioned the minimum securities. So are those getting more stringent, or are they less stringent with your suppliers?
I think that with certainly most of the tier one suppliers, these are the most important suppliers that you have, and so therefore they would be actually the ones that you're going to concentrate on the most. It is becoming more stringent, and that's for a couple of reasons. I think we have seen a lot of breaches, theft of intellectual property that have occurred via a third party. So the most recent, for instance, Marriott breach was through a franchise hotel, employees in a franchise hotel losing some of their access credentials. So again, it can be at that sort of level, or it can be in the manufacturing space. It can be in the R&D space. If we look at things like pharmaceuticals, a vaccine for COVID-19, for instance, very many different organizations all around the world collaborating on that. The value of some of the information that is being accumulated there is immense, because everybody is going to want to be first to market in this sort of space. So very much more stringent, because I think people are learning from the fact that theft of data, access to your corporate systems can happen via a third party. And also because we're probably sharing much more information with our third parties, and we just need to make sure that they understand the value of that to our businesses.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And the is a final question here. The board, what role do they have with the risk of these crown jewels? How should we be engaging them?
It's a really good question. The board has, for me anyway, a huge role to play in all of this, because it's in the boardroom that we set the risk appetite for the organization. It's in the boardroom that we set the overall direction. And so one of the challenges when we get into talking about the protection of assets and management of risk from a security standpoint is what level of access do we have to the boardroom, and also what level of understanding exists in the boardroom of some of the things we're talking about. And I spend a lot of my time certainly working with boards to really help them to understand the risks associated with some of the assets that they have under management, the appropriateness of the response, and indeed just helping them to ask the right questions of their security leaders and risk leaders, so that they get that comfort level, so that they're able to act on the most appropriate information and come up with the right level of risk appetite, for instance, of business risk, that's appropriate for what the board is trying to help the organization to achieve. So aligning it with the overall strategy. And when you manage to get them to talk in those sorts of terms, then the issue of how to protect the mission critical asset and the commitment that comes down from the board is certainly something that you want to have on your side. So it's well worth the effort there, although it is quite tricky for a lot of security departments because they don't normally have that level of access.
Yeah, absolutely. Great advice. This has been really insightful. Is there anything else that you'd like to share before we leave?
I don't think so, Todd, other than to say that, if we go all the way back to your starting questions, why did I get into this particular industry? Despite all of the challenges that we face, I still see it as being a hugely interesting, dynamic, changing environment. And just some of the things we've just been chatting about very briefly here, I think hopefully show that security does touch on a vast range of really core components across the business. And I would really encourage anybody who's thinking of particularly young guys coming out of colleges and that kind of thing to really explore the whole area of cyber and security, because it is a fascinating, really fast changing space.
It is a great field, isn't it? Because all different personality types and backgrounds, there's a role for them somewhere within this field.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks, Steve. And thank you for your great contribution to the CISO Compass book and for taking the time to walk through this with us. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a real pleasure, Todd. No problem at all.
Cybereason is the champion for today's defenders, providing an endpoint security platform to prevent, detect, and respond to malicious operations on computers, mobile devices, servers, and the cloud. Cybereason. End cyber attacks from endpoints to the enterprise to everywhere. Learn more at cybereason.com/CISO stories.